of those polled now believe that Whitewater is important, while 45% say it is not. That may be because of the discoveries of the past few days. Here's part 2 of Chris Bury's report.
Well, I think you could call this maybe the second miraculous discovery within the past 24 hours.
Senator D'Amato, the Clintons' nemesis, could not contain his sarcasm at last week's White House discovery of the long-missing billing records of Mrs. Clinton's work for the Rose Law Firm.
These documents raise, again, very fundamental questions in terms of why and how they were withheld.
The White House maintained the records were found late last week by Hillary Clinton's secretary for correspondence. How could they so suddenly turn up more than 2 years after they were subpoenaed by the independent counsel?
We're being perfectly frank with you. We don't know yet, but we're making everyone available to the independent counsel. We're making every bit of information available, and through that means, we think we can get to the bottom of this. But the bottom line is, if people wanted to hide these documents, they never would have been found. They never would have been produced.
The records in question were known to be in the Clintons' custody during the 1992 campaign, and investigators for the Senate Banking Committee are deeply suspicious the White House could not find them before now.
If those documents were knowingly hidden at the White House for the last 2 years, that might be obstruction of justice, which would be a very serious matter.
This is a typical agent of Senator D'Amato, who is one of the nation's best political henchmen. They throw out charges, they make allegations, they have no evidence to back them up. They have no indication whatsoever, nor is there any evidence whatsoever that these documents were hidden.
The Rose Law Firm billing records are important because, once again, they concern Hillary Clinton's credibility. The question is, how forthcoming has the First Lady been concerning her legal work for a failing savings and loan during the 1980s? Hillary Clinton has always tried to minimize her role. That certainly was the case in April 1994 during a full-dress press conference.
The young attorney, the young bank officer did all the work. It was not an area that I practiced in. It was not an area that I really know anything to speak of about.
The newly released records raise serious questions. If the young attorney, Rick Massey, did all the work, then why do the records show Hillary Clinton held at least 28 conferences with Massey? And if it was not an area Mrs. Clinton knew anything about, why did she hold 16 conferences with Jim McDougal, who headed Madison Savings and Loan?
We now know that Mrs. Clinton worked at least 60 hours on Madison matters. Now, in her sworn affidavit, interrogatories, excuse me, she said that she only had done a minimal amount of work. The records contradict directly what Mrs. Clinton has said about the extent of her work.
Mrs. Clinton is sticking to her guns. This week's Newsweek quotes her as saying, "Over those 15 months, I did about an hour a week worth of work. There is no way that I think of an hour a week over 15 months as being a significant amount of work." The White House has used the records to make its own case.
These billing records support what we've said all along, and that's why you have Republicans now shifting yet again and not arguing about the substance of the billing records now, but arguing about how they were found and how they were produced.
The newly released billing records do, in fact, raise questions not only about the hours Hillary Clinton put in, but the kind of work she did. Investigators are focusing on Mrs. Clinton's possible role in an Arkansas land deal called Castle Grande.
At Castle Grande Estates, you can enjoy the prestige of owning a fine piece of land.
Federal bank regulators have described Castle Grande as a, quote, fictitious transaction designed to keep alive the failing Madison Savings and Loan. In sworn statements to the Resolution Trust Corporation, Hillary Clinton was specifically asked about the deal. Her reply, "I don't believe I knew anything about any of these real estate parcels and projects." But the billing records list more than a dozen conversations with Seth Ward, the major player in the Castle Grande deal.
Her fingerprints are all over the transaction, which, as I said before, bank regulators have said was a fraud.
Hillary Clinton's defenders say the billing records don't suggest any contradiction with her sworn testimony because those records don't mention Castle Grande by name.
If you look at the billing records, that matter is listed as IDC. And she wasn't asked about IDC. And had she been asked about it and had she recalled it, the answer would have been different.
All of this is red meat to a scandal-hungry press corps on the eve of a presidential campaign. Monday, New York Times columnist William Safire called Mrs. Clinton a congenital liar. Today, her husband's spokesman called that an outrageous personal attack and added the president, if he were not the president, would have delivered a more forceful response on the bridge of Mr. Safire's nose. Mr. Clinton himself was more restrained.
I just would like to ask the American people to take a deep breath, relax, and listen to the First Lady's answers. I've said before, I'll say again, everybody in this country had the character that my wife has, we'd be a better place to live.
The president would like to cast Mrs. Clinton as the victim of a vicious Republican strategy to tear away at her character. But the very records the White House keeps finding and the new questions they raise make sustaining that position practically a full-time job. This is Chris Bury for Nightline in Washington.
And when we come back, we'll be joined live by David Kendall, the president and Mrs. Clinton's attorney on Whitewater. I think you'll agree that the First Lady has a growing perception problem. How do you fix that?
Well, I don't know, Ted, that there's very much we can do about the polls. I think all we can really do is continue to cooperate with the various investigations as we've done in an unprecedented fashion, get as much information out there as possible, and let the polls take care of themselves. I think the American people will finally decide exactly what significance the so-called Whitewater matter really has.
How much significance do you think the public is placing and should be placing on the memoranda that are now turning up from some of these White House aides?
Ted, I don't really know. I'm not a pollster. I think that what this proves is that we are cooperating and trying to get the relevant documents out there.
Well, let's talk about the relevance of the relevant documents. The memoranda, parts of which we heard described by Chris Bury this evening. To what degree do they concern you when Mr. Watkins' memorandum, Mr. Stern's memorandum, make it seem as though the First Lady quite clearly was actively involved and aggressively involved in the Travelgate?
Well, I think they've got to be placed in the proper context. The travel office matter involved serious problems of financial mismanagement.
Has anyone been indicted? Has anyone been convicted?
One person was indicted and after a jury trial was acquitted. But financial mismanagement and financial misconduct are two different things. It was clearly established that by a big six accounting firm that there was financial mismanagement. Now, that was a problem that the Clintons had inherited. This was not their travel office. They would have been criticized harshly if they hadn't dealt with it. They tried to deal with it. Mrs. Clinton and several others was concerned that the travel office problems be fixed, and they have been fixed.
When you read what I believe Mr. Watkins had to say, and I'm just sort of taking it a little bit out of context here, but Mrs. Clinton is alleged to have told him on the phone, we need to get these people out and our people in. How do you read that?
Well, I think that's not her recollection. I think what she expressed was a concern that this problem be addressed. This was not her problem. She didn't have all the information, but she wanted the people with authority to take care of the problem, and I think they did.
When you talk about her recollection as it conflicts with the memoranda that Mr. Watkins and Mr. Stern wrote to their various files, you as a good attorney know that's one of the reasons that people write contemporaneous memoranda so that later on they will not have to rely on their memories. Did the First Lady write any memoranda, or is she in this regard just relying on her memory?
Mr. Watkins' memo was hardly contemporaneous. It was several months later, and Mr. Stern's memo in no way contradicts the First Lady's recollection.
One of Mr. Stern's memo and one of Mr. Watkins' memo were in fact written within days of one another. One was written in late May, the other was written in early June.
Well, Mr. Stern's memo was written at the outset of his investigation. He believed it was important to do a thorough investigation, and I think he did.
When it comes to the files now, the records on Whitewater, why is it that when the First Lady was being deposed by the RTC that she had no recollection of, what is the name of it,
It's Castle Grand Estates, as the ad showed. Well, she didn't work on Castle Grand Estates. What the billing records show, and I'm frankly glad that they have been located, and we've been able to provide them because they really do support what we have said. Her work on that matter was very limited. There's no conflict at all with what she told the RTC. The question was about Castle Grand. The work she did for her law firm was on 6 matters. One of those was the so-called IDC land purchase. That
of which Castle Grand was a portion.
Was one portion along with several other portions.
Let me just ask you this.
Castle Grand, however.
Yeah, but when the RTC sends an interrogatory like this, I'm assuming that she's sitting down with people like you, her attorneys. Would you not, when you saw that name on the list, have said, should we take a look at what each of these things is so that we know for sure whether or not it is not involved in something that you have worked on?
Well, we certainly did that, and her responses were quite detailed and covered over 75 pages. This happened, I think it should be said, over 10 years ago. We provided a detailed response to all the questions that we could.
Those, and we are beginning to run out of time, you're right, the responses were about matters that occurred 10 years ago, but the documents relating to her billing were made available to you. You got those documents again 2.5 years ago.
Well, we didn't get those documents. We've gotten the documents that we produced quite recently. We turned them over within 24 hours of their discovery.
But, I mean, you were able to look at those documents in order to figure out what had happened and when and what she had been doing. In other words, those, one would think, might have refreshed the First Lady's memory.
Well, we certainly reviewed the available documents, Ted, and none of those documents, nor do any of the billing records, show that she did any work on Castle Grand. Now, her responses were perfectly accurate, and she's tried to provide accurate information about this, if I may say, very old matter.
Mr. Kendall, you're good to come in on such a cold, wintry night, and I assume we'll have a chance to talk about this at greater length at some time in the future. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
I'll be back in a moment.